Great. Wonderful to be with you all. Hello, whatever the time zones. So as Tessa briefly mentioned, a lot of my work has been kind of more in the refugee and forced migration space, and then more at the intersection of this. And before I kick off my PowerPoint, I just thought I'd say that really my interest in anticipatory action was born out of a lot of my frustration with my kind of research on refugees and seeing refugee responses. So for the last 12 years, I'd done a lot of work on refugee livelihoods and self-reliance and realized that what I was seeing was time and again, people being displaced for years, and not just a few years, but between 10 years and 26 years, which is sort of the average span of displacement, and realizing that a lot of the support and assistance they were receiving was still in the emergency phase, a decade, 2 decades after displacement. And so to me, anticipatory action offers a really exciting way to think about responding before the disaster happens in a way that we often just don't see with refugee assistance. So as Tessa mentioned, I will briefly speak more specifically about anticipatory action in camps, but kind of broadly as well. So if we're doing a really brief overview, as many of you probably know, there are over 100 million forcibly displaced people globally. So the UNHCR had said, this is a record that should never have been set. And we're seeing now, in contrast to, past decades, a lot more displacement occurring because of not just conflict, but climate, food insecurity, a whole breadth of issues. And also people are being displaced multiple times. So the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which is sort of the global center to really understand people displaced within their own country, started recording displacements in the plural. So realizing that people were moving, maybe because of conflict, and then having to move again because of flooding in their area and so on. So millions of these people are in camps. And what we see, which was kind of discussed in some other presentations as well, is that the people are often in the most hazard-prone, low-resource areas. So be that refugee camps in really remote areas of countries, or people in the informal settlements of cities and so on. So as an example, some of my research has been not with Rohingya refugees as directly, but more with humanitarians working in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which is a string of 34 camps. And refugees are faced with flash floods, cyclones, landslides, also fires, which are happening in part because, as you can see from this picture, the structures are so close together, which we can get back to as well. So when we think about anticipatory action in refugee and IDP camps, maybe the first thing to say is that it's actually pretty rare. So we have fairly few examples of this happening. And even in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, it's much more of a focus on early warnings and early action rather than a full-fledged, anticipatory action with capital letters, which, we discussed earlier, involves triggers and forecasts and pre-agreed finance and so on. So a lot of the work that's happening for refugees and displaced populations is kind of a lesser level of that sense. Not to say that that's at all less, full of assistance for people, but kind of an important distinction. So when we look at camps, they're often lacking in long-term planning. And it's often because, people are meant to be displaced temporarily, right? So we think of camps as, places with tents and places where people are aggregating, at the border of a country, hoping or assuming to be able to go home soon. But as I said, that's not what we're seeing in reality. And so the fact that they're not built with durable, resilient material means that, of course, they're much more at risk of climate hazards. And what's important to note for refugees in particular, because these are people that are in another country, right, and being allowed to be there in some form, is that often the fact that these camps are so impermanent is because of the government, not necessarily because even refugees themselves, want to go home. Often they say they don't. And then, humanitarians obviously want to provide as much support as assistance, but might be restricted by the location of a camp. In Bangladesh, for example, there's policy restrictions on even the type of material. So nothing that's considered kind of durable can be used in the camp, which obviously makes it a lot harder to have people withstand climate hazards well. And at the same time, I would say, we can look at camps as havens from both conflict and climate hazards. So a lot of my work in Uganda was in a refugee settlement, and something that people said to me time and again is they said, Uganda has given us peace and they've given us land, and those are two things our country couldn't give them. So I think that's an important point as well. So when we think of anticipatory action, there's actually a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunities. So there's coordination that's happening, and often there's an active UN cluster system, for example, operating in camps or around areas that we don't sometimes see in other places. So some of my research has also focused on an intervention in South Sudan, so in the Bentu IDP camp and Bentu town, surrounding areas, that's been run by OCHA. So Seth is also familiar with this kind of early action intervention. So the weather forecast side of it, which you can learn more about from Seth, just wasn't strong enough to do formal anticipatory action because of the conflict. So there just wasn't enough knowledge, in part because so much had been destroyed from weather systems and of the weather systems and so on. So there was a decision, though, to allocate $15 million in the camp and around the camp to really try and prepare for flooding. So South Sudan has experienced 4 horrendous, I think we could say, years of flooding. And in many places, the flooding has just never receded. So the ground is saturated. So people are living in floodwater. They're, sleeping on grass islands that they've constructed themselves. There's, very high rates of malnutrition. They're eating lily pads to survive. And in this camp, there's over 100,000 people, that many of whom were first displaced by conflict and then could never go home again because of the flooding in their areas. So again, kind of that intersection. But this place was, selected in part because it already was a site of humanitarian intervention. So it was a former people of concerns camp turned IDP camp. There was ongoing humanitarian action. There were, locations for some pre-positioning of goods. There were, UN agencies already active. So in that sense, it was seen as really a positive. And in large part, at least for parts of the year, it's accessible, which isn't the option in all parts of South Sudan and in many countries. And there's kind of the finances to try to make it as accessible as possible. So even with this, a lot of the people that I've spoken to have said, this has been useful. This has really, helped people. There's been preparations, in time. In October, so just a few months ago, there were 2 dike breaches. So really the camp was at very, very high risk of being overrun. And this was a huge issue in and of itself, but it was also, the highest point in the area. It had over 100,000 people. It's, surrounded by areas, where there's been conflict, where there's already flooding. And so, a lot of the UN people that I spoke to said, our #1 goal is just to prevent this camp from getting flooded because we don't know where these people will go. We don't have the funding to move them. So I think this speaks as well to some of the challenges of this context, but also just even thinking about the construction of a camp, and on one hand, a haven, but on the other hand, what's being engendered through bringing people together, through, offering assistance, but then maybe not being able to kind of follow through if these people, have come to a place for safety and then it's no longer safe. So I'm going to briefly kind of shift focus a bit from camps more broadly and just talk about refugees specifically. So in contrast to internally displaced people, refugees, are not nationals of the country they're in, and they often lack rights. So there's often a lot of limitations. Generally, they don't have the right to work in a country. And if they're in camps, it's probably, or in part, because they don't have the right to freedom of movement. So they can't necessarily legally leave the camp that they're in. And often very limited access to social protection, to government assistance. So either living independently or receiving food rations from humanitarian organizations and so on, as you all know. But something that really struck me when we think about this bigger context is, well, what happens when there's a climate hazard, when there's the flooding, what happens when there's a cyclone or so on? And if people can't leave an area, what do you do? So one of the humanitarian key informants I spoke with in Bangladesh said, we don't even speak about evacuation. It's not an option because these people can't leave. So we try to find, the higher areas or the safer areas of camps, but we don't have that option to move beyond that. So this is obviously a huge consideration for anticipatory action, right? There's a new layer of constraints, and there's questions, can refugees leave an area? Also just thinking beyond in terms of refugees, often not being counted in by government censuses, for example, if they're in cities, do people know where refugees are? Are there accurate numbers? And these and many, many other considerations are really key if we're thinking about how to implement an effective, anticipatory action intervention. And then briefly, what might be particular about experiences of displacement and conflict, and kind of considering these for anticipatory action. So like many other conflict affected populations, refugees and displaced people often have very high rates of, mental health issues, PTSD, depression, anxiety. It ranges, the kind of the research ranges by population type, actually by nationality. Often though high experiences of trauma. And, a lot of these are born from the disruption of social networks, obviously experiences of violence. But when we're thinking about this for anticipatory action, what might that mean in terms of what we want to do differently? So again, an example from Bangladesh, people said that they would rather die than be separated again. So these are Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, and their experiences of family separation were so devastating that they wanted to stay where they were. And in other cases, there's a feeling like a camp might be a place that feels like a safe place, and there's finally somewhere that people are starting to rebuild a life. So to be told to move or to have other actions that don't actually feel like they were choosing them or that they might not understand can mean that, these won't be taken up, basically. Other issues, possible mistrust of authority figures for very good reasons. A lot of the refugees I work with were persecuted by their own government. And that has huge ramifications for information uptake, dissemination. There's really obvious ones like language, so if we're trying to disseminate information to, even within a camp, maybe people with multiple nationalities, that's a huge effort by humanitarians and other actors to, have those different languages, different people to disseminate information, have it be trusted, and so on. So kind of out of this and my work with refugees, one of the things I've started thinking more about is this idea of trauma-informed programming. So what might we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about experiences of trauma and anticipatory action? So again, kind of the obvious of targeted communication campaigns, but moving beyond that, what should that information include? Who will people trust who are given information? And then this idea of, how do we encourage mental health support, not just during, but before a disaster? And, a lot of my work has been with refugee-led organizations. And so there's been more and more effort to have, trained counselors in some form who are also refugees who are living in these communities, and to have them be with people during, disasters, which are scary no matter what. But if you're thinking of what else that might bring up for people, I think really, really important to think about, and hugely unfocused on, I think, in a way that's really detrimental in wider kind of humanitarian responses in terms of funding and so on. And then crucial, this idea of building in time to build trust. And that goes back to who are people working with and so on. But if you're thinking of a sudden onset event, that might be really tricky if you have 5 days of lead time to activate and to give people hopefully cash or some sort of good provisions, but also to give them information and to help them make decisions. If you don't have a longer term presence in a community, or you don't have the people that do, then it might not work. So to wrap up, what else? What next? I mean, there's obviously many, many threads to pick up from what I shared, but I'd say there's, a very strong need to strengthen appropriate trauma-informed early warning systems in camps and anticipatory action interventions when they hopefully start happening more widely. And a lot already exists, in the humanitarian sector in that way that I think we could be learning from as well, for sure. And there's a huge need as well for research and action on refugees and IDPs in cities, so in urban areas, and to really consider the potential and the limitations. So, where are the refugees? They're often invisible in urban areas. They often don't want to be found because they don't feel safe. Maybe they're still being persecuted, as is the case with many of the people I've worked with. Language barriers, if you're living, next to nationals, you might not be listening to their radio channel and you might not hear about what's coming up in terms of a weather event. And so obviously area-based approaches might be most effective. So targeting a really hazard-prone informal settlement, for example, where one kind of assumes or knows that there's a high level of displaced people. And then I really am hoping and wanting to work more with other kind of actors in this space of how could we really make a large-scale pilot happen for anticipatory action in a refugee camp. So some work is happening, as I've mentioned, but I think we need to see a lot more in this and at a larger scale, because in terms of my work, I think this is an intersection that we know levels of displacement are rising. The amount, severity of extreme weather events are rising, and we're just going to see more and more of these intersections. So I'll wrap up here, but I'd love to be in touch if you're interested. I already know some of the names and faces, but I'd love to speak with you all more if you're interested. Thanks so much.